to the class about endurance training at altitude. So as an overview of this presentation, I will be introducing the topic itself and its relevance. I'll be including key terms that's highlighted throughout the whole presentation. I'll be introducing a couple articles and discussing and critiquing them, and including the limitations and future research of each article. I will be finishing on some final notes and just a summary of the presentation and just its overall relevance and why I wanted to speak about it. So here I'd like to highlight the key terms: sea level, altitude, hypoxia, erythropoietin, I can't say that word, EPO is an easier way to say it, and then red blood cells. So sea level is considered to be the base level for measuring elevation and the Earth's depth. Altitude is any elevation above sea level. Hypoxia is a condition where the body is deprived of adequate oxygen supply. EPO is produced and secreted by the kidneys, and it stimulates production of red blood cells, and then red blood cells are what carry oxygen. So here I want to lead into what endurance training is in general. So it is one of the 4 types of exercises along with balance, strength, and flexibility. It is considered an aerobic exercise, so it's a cardiovascular type of conditioning, and some examples include walking, jogging, running, such as cross country or just track and field or anything like that, and then marathon running. There's also biking, swimming. Honestly, any activity that exerts physical activity at a high level that increases your breathing and heart rate. I'd also like to apologize. I can barely breathe or talk right now, so I'm sorry if it's hard to understand. So how do we train for endurance? So there are 5 total stages of endurance training. So phase 1 is the base phase, so it's about 4 weeks to 6 months. And it builds aerobic conditioning and improves cardio and muscular endurance. It's the adapting phase from going from no endurance training to entering the phase of endurance training, and it just keeps on building after that phase. So phase 2 is the build phase, so it's the threshold phase. It is about 4 to 8 weeks. It's a faster pace of training, and it builds on the first stage, of course, and it better develops the cardiothoracic system and increases the muscle adaptability to faster pace running and intensity, and it just slowly gets the body used to endurance in general and the type of training it consists of. Then we lead into phase 3, which is the peak phase, and it lasts about 2 to 3 weeks, and here you will be running from the highest intensity, which is relating back to why it's called the peak phase. Then we fall into the taper phase, phase 4, and here it's about 1 to 3 weeks. This is when you're nearing close to race day. You'll slowly cut back on that intensity. It's more of a recovery phase to keep you up and going before you hit the race day. It doesn't tire you out too much. Then you hit race day, and all of your effort and work put into endurance training will be paid off, or not, depending on what you put into it. And then after the race day, what's really important is recovery phase. Here's when your body reacts to all of that training, and it lasts about 2 to 5 weeks. It's low intensity activities and workouts. This phase mainly focuses on mentally and physically recovering from the lengthy training cycle that you just endured. Okay, so after explaining what endurance training is, I want to introduce what sea level is. As related to what I said and the key terms, it is considered the base level for measuring elevation and depth of Earth. So how can we measure it? Sea level is measured adjacent to the land at various locations during the Metonic cycle, which is a lengthy time. It's 19 years. And it's taking those measurements and averaging them out to better define sea level. It is chosen to be measured asynchronous to the Metonic cycle because it allows scientists and researchers to account for the long-term variations of the ocean's orbit. This then leads into the question of what is altitude. So it's any elevation above what is considered sea level, and typically high elevation is considered 7,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. And as we ascend into altitude, the volume expands because of the lowering of atmospheric pressure, which results in a reduction of available oxygen to the muscles. Training near altitude can help the adaptation to training and performing at both altitude and sea level. Okay, so what are some benefits to altitude training and just in general? What does altitude do? So when at altitude, there's less oxygen drawn into the body, and then therefore there's less oxygen delivered to those working muscles during exercise. Less oxygen is delivered to those muscles, causing a natural boost then in red blood cell production, which is what carries oxygen. The athlete's body is physiologically temporarily altered to have higher red blood cells, which allows more oxygen to be carried to the muscles when competing at sea level. So then, what are some effects of being born at altitude? It can allow some long-term physiological adaptations, like adaptations associated with growing at altitude. It can give a competitive edge to those who are born at sea level. Okay, so we've got altitude and endurance training. So what is the aim of endurance training at altitude? So the needed oxygen of the muscles of these athletes often exceed the capacity of the cardiovascular system. So the use of altitude training is to increase the total volume of red blood cells and hemoglobin mass in order to improve this limiting link. So how can we do it? Increasing arterial blood oxygen carrying capacity results in an increase in VO2 and enhancing performance at both sea level and altitude. Alright, so I'd like to introduce this article based on real and simulated altitude training and performance. So here we've got what happens to our bodies specifically. So due to altitude, the drop in oxygen stimulates the synthesis and release of EPO, which is the hormone produced by the kidney, which stimulates more red blood cell and hemoglobin production. What has been suggested by research for training? So in general, coaches and athletes commonly use the use of altitude training to complement regular training at sea level. There are a variety of different models of altitude training that vary from low and high altitude living and training to breathing hypoxic gas while living and training normally at sea level. There's multiple ways of doing so when training at altitude levels. There are controversial literature reviews about the mechanisms involved in improved performance after altitude training. There are observed improvements and those that claim there are minimal to no change. What are some things to consider with training at altitude? There are some problems that do arise. So not everyone can acclimate and do well at altitude training. Altitude sickness is real. It's something that even those who live at altitude experience, especially when we go to any elevated locations from what we're used to. And when we ascend within the environment and anyone else that goes somewhere that's higher elevation, you can experience drowsiness, dehydration, immune suppression, appetite suppression, and even nausea. So different modes of altitude training. There is live high, train low, live high, train high at low intensity, live low, train low, live low and train high, but at moderate levels. So Live high, train low model is when you live at a high altitude but you train at a much lower level and they're living out of their living conditions, so such as sea level. What's considered high to train in is considered dangerous, which is anything above 7,500 meters is considered dangerous to one's health, and the sweet spot is about 500 meters above sea level is tolerable for short periods of time. Live high, train high at a low intensity. So you're living high and you train high, but at a much lower intensity, so you can moderate the altitude a little bit better. Live low, train low, it's anyone that living at sea level, but also training and competing at that same level. Live low, train high, is living at a low sea level, but training at a higher elevation, but at moderate levels and moderate to high intensity. So what are some advancements for altitude simulation? There is a altitude apartment, altitude TENS, intermittent hypoxic exposure, intermittent hypoxic training. So how do these work? So there can be hypobaric chambers, or nitrogen dilution, or oxygen filtration, and these provide a hypoxic simulation within these type of environments, and this just helps reduce the pressure that we're breathing in. So environments that simulate higher altitude include all of these four. So an altitude apartment is a sealed off room with lower oxygen levels due to either a nitrogen dilution or oxygen extraction. Altitude tents are portable altitude systems that mimic the same process as altitude apartments, so also similarly doing nitrogen dilution or oxygen extraction. Intermittent hypoxic exposure. So these are short bouts of exposure to hypoxic air when at rest, alternated with normoxic air. So hypoxic air is considered, I believe it's 9 to 15%, and then normoxic air is around 21%. Yeah, and then intermittent hypoxic training it's similar to the intermittent hypoxic exposure, so it's breathing hypoxic air intermittently with normoxic air, but during exercise, so that is the difference. In here, up until about 2009, the Live High, Train Low model was deemed the most beneficial for elite athletes. Something though to consider here when we're referring to this graph that was included in this article. The table, so here you see that the improvements in performance are not always correlated or associated with an increase in VO2 max, and that there are other physiological measures that could be causing the improved performance. There's enough evidence that suggests that all methods of altitude training Are you kidding me, this laptop? I'm sorry. Methods of altitude training can benefit athletic performance, but the Live High, Train Low technique is recommended for elite athletes. There is no guarantee. Some athletes may not be able to handle the conditions of altitude due to the negative effects that may occur, such as altitude sickness. I thought the use of this article was a good overview of understanding altitude and the types of modes that can be simulated to be able to train at this level. And I like that there's a graph that included and helped better visualize how the different types of training modes at altitude can increase your VO2 max and just power output based on the living and training levels. So next I'd like to introduce this article, Improved Performance in National Level Runners with Increased Training Load at 1,600 and 1,800 meters. So here I have included the abstract. That was an excerpt from the article itself, just overlaying the purpose, methods, and results, but we will dive into it in depth. So what does this article, what type of questions does it raise? It asks what altitude level to train at, what is the peak mode to do this training at, when to continue altitude training, and what restrictions are there. So athletes use altitude preparation to raise sea level output following adaptations acquired at altitude, acclimation, and or related hypoxia preparation. So referring back to some of the questions being raised, so what altitude level to train at? So altitude training guidelines usually mean about 3 to 4 weeks at 2,000 to 2,500 meters to evoke a hematological adaptation, which is supposed to advance endurance performance. When to continue altitude training. So here is when considering how is it even beneficial and for how long. So previous literature evidence has suggested that competing within 48 to 72 hours within the descent of altitude, or about after 2 to 3 weeks of reacclimatization to sea level, is the window time frame of either continuing or competing after altitude training. And then restrictions that may apply to altitude training include topographical and or seasonal limitations. This may restrict athletes' access to altitude training overall. So the methods used in this study included 24 elite runners as participants, and they first completed the 3 weeks of training at home or close to sea level. Then they were divided into groups, and then they were completed either 3 weeks at 600 meters, 1,600 meters, or 1,800 meters. Of course, the control group was the 0 to 600 meters, which was considered sea level, and the experimental groups were 1,600 meters and 1,800 meters above sea level. The results were then compared based on an 11-week competition period, which consisted of about 1 to 8 races at sea level. And the experimental group was given as well during the competition weeks. They were given iron orally daily to ensure that EPO adaptations have not been affected by the insufficient supply of iron once moved down to sea level. So then it moves into the procedure section, which includes the type of training. So each athlete completed 6 to 11 running and about 1 to 2 strength sessions per week. And their total hemoglobin mass was measured prior to intervention and then was also tested after. Each week consisted of 1 to 3 high-intensity running sessions, a long run, and a lower-intensity aerobic continuous run. So this then leads into the performance section, and here we question, how are the results measured? So just an overview of the type of athletes first. So out of the 24, there were 6 athletes that were 800-meter runners, 10 athletes that were 1,500-meter runners, and 8 athletes that were 3,000 or 5,000-meter runners. So these participants were recorded both before and after the applied intervention, and the pre-altitude measurement of each participant was their best time achieved in competition within 2 months prior to the beginning of the intervention, and if the competition time within the 2 months prior to this intervention was not available, their best time within the previous 2 seasons was recorded. Here this leads into then the results section. So how was the experimental group versus the control group, and what were the differences? So there was significant improvement was observed in the race time within the 1,600 meters and 1,800 meter altitude environment in comparison to the control group. Following the intervention, 4 weeks after, moderate improvements were recorded in race time within the 1600 and 1800 meter altitude environment, and it yielded about a 0.7 to 0.9% increase in comparison to the control group. And also, based off of the hemoglobin, the total that was recorded after the intervention, within the 1600 1800 group, there was an increase, but no recorded increase within the control group. So overall, the study yielded race time and hemoglobin total improvements within altitude training groups compared to control, and the current study observed the majority of peak performances were achieved following 4 or more weeks at sea level, allowing for reacclimatization. So some limitations to note within this study is that those in the control group, they were at home or close to sea level, and they were not in the environment of a training camp as those that were at 1600 or 1800 meters above sea level. So a training camp effect was not considered for those in the control group, and comparison to the control group, technically I've been training at home, so that filters into the pre-intervention training as well. Something I'd like to include as a future direction within this study is that include a training camp for control group, so all of those that were in the control are in the same environment, and that the pre-intervention of the 3 weeks at sea level should all be completed by participants at the same place, so location will not vary and better to compare to the control group in itself. So in conclusion, the results yielded greater performance by participants living and training at 1600 and 1800 meters compared to the control group when competing at sea level after the intervention. So the initial takeaway from the study is that overall, I think that this was a good study to include when speaking about endurance training and altitude, because it involved a study comparing endurance training of elite athletes at sea level and altitude to better comprehend the effects of altitude on performance. So the initial takeaway notes I want to include over this presentation are some controversies that have been brought up based on altitude training. So it alters the physiology of the body and gives athletes a competitive edge, and some people may argue that altitude training gives an advantage over others that don't have the opportunity to train at altitude. And then in response to that, it's been said that it allows those that follow the rules to compete legally against those that may dope and have their own competitive edge. I wanted to relate this to world experience, what kind of world experience? Just America, I guess. But something that's often discussed, I always hear in the preliminaries of NFL games against the Denver Broncos when at home, often there's constant talk about the advantage for the Broncos because they train and compete at altitude, and visiting teams are not used to the thinner air, and that gives them the competitive edge over other teams. I want to move into then future directions. Comparison of altitude training between the 4 types of exercise and which one may benefit more would be a good direction to take in understanding, because there is flexibility, strength, endurance, and balance. So we can see how altitude training may benefit or not for those different types of exercise. I would also like to focus direction towards understanding the lasting effects after the training. It was included the optimal window, but how long does it actually benefit in the long run? Must one have to reacclimate to altitude, and what are the effects on that? Something else I think would be interesting is comparing athletes born at altitude versus those at sea level and implications of training interventions, and comparing the results between those 2 different types of people. There are so many different directions this research can be taken, and I only included a few this is a topic that can be expanded way more, and I'd like to see that research surface. And the last thing I wanted to highlight is, why was this even important? So endurance training is one of the 4 types of exercises that I recently listed, and anyone looking to enhance their performance endurance-wise may take interest in the benefits of altitude training. I thought that this was an interesting topic, especially because I am from Colorado, so something that I personally feel a difference is when I'm running. So when I visit my parents and I'm running in Colorado, it's definitely harder at first when I'm getting used to the altitude, but then as soon as I get back to Nashville, it's a lot easier for me when I initially transition to a lower altitude, but I do notice if I do not stay consistent, the benefits start to fade and I just go back to normal, and I'm not the best runner. But overall, I thought this was an interesting topic that relates to exercise and was just interesting enough to bring up in general for this class. Thank you.